everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation to speak to you all here in Barcelona. It's great to be back. I was here 8 or 9 years ago, I think, and gave a talk, and it's great to be in this place that feels very like a lab, an experimental studio, which is great and necessary in our profession and in our education. So I'm going to start. Am I blocking the view here, or am I okay to stand? Okay. I'm going to start with this map of Canada. I'm from Canada. I'm from this part here, way down at the bottom of Ontario. And the reason I use this as a way of telling you where I'm from is because it's a geological map, and the colors obviously represent different geological strata and sort of deep time. Some of these landscapes have rock that's 4 billion years old at the surface of the earth, and it's just a really interesting way of describing a place that's not about political boundaries or nation states where lines are drawn on the land. This is the kind of essence of the place, and it's a good reminder. And this is an image of an island that I spent my summers on when I was a child, and actually it's still in the family, this island, and it's in the Great Lakes in Georgian Bay. And you can see how this landscape is undeveloped. It's basically rocks, the Canadian Shield, and trees that grow more or less straight out of the rocks, and water and sky. And it's a kind of primordial landscape and a wonderful counterpoint to living in London. But I think it's, in a way, my obsession with trees, which David and IAAC kind of tapped into with my project with them for the landmark project for the London Design Festival. You know, my association with trees goes way back, and here you can see these are pines and spruce in the Canadian Shield, and they managed to grow straight out of cliffs, straight out of the rock. And again, I'll sort of reiterate some of the points David made, that trees give us not only oxygen, they not only clean the air, but they produce water vapor through transpiration, which creates clouds, which creates rain. They provide decorative material, structural material. I honestly think that we should all be in awe and worshiping timber as sort of a core to our sustenance as human beings. And not only that, I also feel we have a spiritual connection to trees, and this is something that you feel, I think, when you spend a lot of time in the wilderness. And at the Venice Biennale in 2018, I took part in this exhibition, which was all for Alison's exhibition called the Assembly of the Future for non-human species. And my installation was the core samples. These are geological core samples of the Canadian Shield. Those are pictures of the rocks that I spend time on every year, that emerge from the lake. And these rocks are 4 billion years old, because they're the only place on the Earth's surface is the Canadian Shield where the original Earth's crust is on the surface. And so it's just a really poignant reminder of kind of deep time and nature, and how we as a species are very fragile and need to respect and honor this landscape that we dwell on. So I traded in Canada, its cities and also its wilderness, for London in 1989. That's Bedford Square and the AA, and I find it also kind of poignant that nature's kind of captured in this oval in London squares, but they are a kind of, interestingly, that captured nature was part of the Georgian development strategy to attract people to buy land, buy property on those squares. So nature and trees and open space was part of a kind of urban design strategy. So in 2017, which was the same year I was invited to do the Smile, or the Landmark Festival with IAAC, I celebrated the 20-year anniversary of my practice, and I published a book that year called Ideals Then Ideas, and I staged a party at Somerset House. That Somerset House, that's not my party, that's a concert, but maybe the next one we'll have a stage and a band. But it's a kind of compilation of projects and ideas, but I wanted to make a statement of ideals, that the ideals I carry as a person come before the ideas, the architectural ideas, and it's something that I used to use to sort of explain or help students who are trying to search for their idea. Where's the source of my idea? Where can I find it? And I would advise them, and I still do, look to your ideals. What are the places that you find the most meaningful, the most beautiful? And I also kind of distilled the sense that of duty I have to deliver places that are authentic, generous, civic, and beautiful. And so I identified these 4 ideals, made a kind of declaration. Back in 2017, people weren't using the word beauty very much. That was still a kind of banished term in architecture. I think now the profession has come to terms with actually taking ownership of this idea or ideal of beauty, of producing beauty for public enjoyment in how we build. And as I mentioned, this party coincided around the same time that I was invited by IAAC to design the Landmark Pavilion for the London Design Festival. And this is made of hardwood CLT. It's tulip wood or yellow poplar from the eastern forests of America. It's made of waste wood, and the whole project was made of 12 panels of CLT. And it's the first time a structure of this span was ever achieved, and probably might be the last in terms of cantilevers with CLT. And this was also regenerative, carbon negative in terms of how it was able to be built using a lot of timber and then sequestering that carbon. So since that party in 2017, we all read a lot of books, but I think these 3 books have been kind of transformational or very influential in my way of thinking. Places of the Heart, the psychogeography of everyday life, is written by a neuroscientist, Colin Ellard, also University of Waterloo. He explains the kind of neuroscience of how we experience awe or beauty or attachment to place, belonging. Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a book written by an Indigenous botanist, so Robin Wall Kimmerer. She was raised on a reserve and basically explains the Indigenous worldview as a counterpoint to the scientific rationalist explanation of nature and botany. And it's really amazing if you really want to have your mind blown about how to think about nature and the relationships between species and how humans should be in a way more sensitive and more grateful to the gifts that nature gives us. And then A Trillion Trees, Fred Pierce was clearly one of the inspirations for the Forested Futures film, and it's also kind of mind-blowing when you read about how we really depend on trees and always have. There's been there really couldn't be human beings without trees. So this is a picture from my trip to the Allegheny State Forest with IAAC, and I went on this trip on a quest to discover the source of the American black cherry, or cherry wood, that I've been using in my projects for 10 or 15 years. And I didn't really know. I thought, I don't know, cherry trees, sort of some kind of mid-sized tree with a big canopy, probably not with a lot of fruit. But the amazing thing about these forests, the deep forests, the trees with the really dark bark, the black bark, those are American black cherries. And they're huge forest trees. And they're 90 or 100 feet tall. And you can see forest trees, they don't produce branches from the bottom to the top. They save all their branches for the top of the tree, because that's where the top of the forest canopy is. And that's how you get this really beautiful knot-free wood, because they're a forest tree. And there I am with some of the lumbermen and Fred Pierce and I think David on some cherry wood logs. And I've used cherry wood in a lot of my projects, but this is the first piece I did in my house, which is a staircase. It's a suspended staircase. It's made of 40 mil thick solid cherry, and it's made from one tree. So this stair, which is this kind of wonderful object that I use every day, is kind of like being in a tree. And I think if we even use the word, use our words differently, instead of calling wood, we could call it trees or tree material, and you think about it differently. It's like calling, water rain. Water is actually rain, and you think about it differently if you describe it as rain. Here's a place where I've used cherry, solid cherry, in the Cohen Quad in Oxford. But just to give you a little bit more background, because I think it's really important, a lot of architects don't talk about their kind of origin story. And so in my journey into architecture, I studied, I grew up in Ontario. I was very young when Expo 67 happened, but it was like a moment, a really memorable moment in Canadian culture and cultural history. It was our centenary year, and all of this incredible futuristic architecture was happening, which actually looks like a lot like what is still being designed today. People wore white gloves when they went to expos back then, which was kind of incredible. And I used to go to Toronto. That's Toronto in the kind of early 1970s. The three black towers are Mies TD Bank buildings, and they're all completely buried by towers now. And then Ontario Place here, these metabolist pods floating on the water, is still there. The O'Keefe Centre, all of this really optimistic modernism was happening. But Toronto also had this incredible tradition of neo-Gothic and neo-Romanesque, Richardsonian Romanesque architecture. And my mother used to always point out to me these incredible historic buildings that have wonderful craftsmanship, iconography, decoration, organic references. And I think it was the beginning of my sort of a kind of curiosity about why was there this dichotomy between kind of historic architecture that everybody loved and thought was really beautiful, and then sort of modernist architecture, which was kind of dynamic, but just not a lot to love to the public eye. And then I studied my sort of 7 years at Waterloo, went to Europe and had a kind of revelation, the European city. This is Place des Vosges, and those are my cousins who had rented a flat in Place des Vosges, and the proportions and just amazing quality of space in those apartments in Place des Vosges just, sort of convinced me that the French door was the best kind of window you could possibly have in housing. So every housing project I've done since has French doors. I don't do any other kind of window. And they all go back to my experience of Place des Vosges. Also, the colonnaded base is a part of my influence. Along with Rome, I studied in Rome for a term. This is Hadrian's Villa. These are actually photographs I took with my SLR camera back in the day. The markets of Trajan and the wonderful kind of timelessness of Roman brick and this sense of the earth and the architecture merging into each other and becoming a kind of landscape of form where you don't know where the ground plane is or the building starts and stops, and this idea of a kind of plastic architecture. I also had a kind of grand tour trip to London in 1985, and here was Battersea Power Station, now completely drowned in new development, sadly. But it was incredible to experience London. It was sort of like Rome as it was before it was a ruin. The neoclassicism of London, this is Rand, St. Paul's, incredibly powerful forms and geometries. This is St. Pancras Station was completely black because of the pollution. The Soane Museum, London was pretty grim back then in the 80s, but I was really deeply influenced by just the experience of Lutyens, the National Trust houses. This is Salisbury Cathedral, the Georgian terraces, the houses and gardens. There's a sort of deep relationship between the English sensibility towards nature, walled gardens, framing nature, and a kind of poetic approach to that sort of space between architecture and nature. I then did my thesis at Waterloo, and this was a really tough project. I took on this huge piece of Buffalo in New York, which was a sort of abandoned housing project, and did a proposal to re-inhabit and restore the city and the urban fabric and create a culture of place, of sports and open space and new housing typologies. So I kind of tackled the city in North America, and then after that I thought, okay, it's time to leave. I'd worked a lot in Canada, in Toronto, lots of different practices, and I sort of felt a draw towards Europe, and in particular the housing of London, the Georgian terraced houses are, the quality of the city is very much an expression of its housing, and I was very interested in sort of bringing my work and thinking in housing and applying it somewhere. And I started working with Ron Arendts for 7 years. I founded Ron Arendts Associates with Ron, and we designed the Tel Aviv Opera foyer interiors. That sort of sculptural freeform island, we called it, is in Tel Aviv in the opera house there. And we designed and built our own studio out of tension fabric. And this was a workshop, metal workshop and design studio all under one roof. But after 7 years with Ron, I decided to set out on my own. And in a way, the 4 ideals that I mentioned earlier, I see it more as a dialogue, that architecture is a kind of conversation. It's circular. It's a continuum of memory, context, nature, and ideals. But this conversation obviously has a purpose, and it's to create a sense of identity and community and belonging for the clients and the clientele, the constituencies we serve. And so now my office has projects around the world, Taiwan, Middle East, the UK, and Canada. These are some of the projects on the drawing board, and I'll talk about some of them in more detail. But I'll start with the house. Like many architects start with houses as their as their way in. And I always believe that a house, if you get a commission for a house or an extension, you have to make it a thesis project. You have to make it an essay. You have to experiment as much as you can, because it's really the only kind of project that you have as an architect where you can control everything. You can sort of push the ideas and have control over every detail. And this house, the VXO house, was actually a conversion of a 1960s house, so a front extension, rebuilding the whole house inside, a new site-specific artwork, that blue wall by Simon Patterson. And then it became a campus that expanded to include a gymnasium and a study and a carport and a landscape. So a tiny commission became a big project. And this is the artwork by Simon Patterson, so it's a wall, so the art is part of the architecture. It's a little bit of a tribute to Mies here, the Barcelona pavilion, because this wall goes from the inside to the outside and is a kind of garden wall and an architectural wall. And so this trio of buildings was recognized and got an RIBA award, and it gave me a foothold into the UK market. But I sort of rejected that 1960s language after I did this project. I thought that's kind of, I don't really need to do that anymore, sort of expressive structure, everything elemental, and started working with the idea of folded planes, making architecture out of one thing, a simple sheet of bronze in this case that does everything, is the roof, the colonnade, the bench, the sunshade. Trying to reduce architecture to its absolute minimum. And then I decided to start working with geometry in a slightly more plastic way, and with vernacular. So this is a beach house in Essex, where I sort of took a hipped roof, vernacular fisherman's house of the locale, and sculpted the facades, and this created a kind of geometric integration of facades and roof planes and interiors. The next project, the Lens House in London, a similar idea of kind of a real continuity, geometric continuity between inside and outside. And I took this idea also into housing, and this is a project, Newhall in Harlow outside of London, 84 houses, and here I was trying to make a kind of sculptural ensemble with developer housing. And so these houses are referencing the Essex barn, the blackened timber, the big roof forms, and started working with the roof as a major form of expression, a shaped roof, a pitched roof. And then in a way that those experiments culminated in two houses. This is the Mesh House in London. Again, trying to find a sort of geometric and material synthesis between sort of very constrained sites, view planes and angles protecting rights of light, but making a courtyard house out of what would normally be just a big, deep, blocky house. So nature is captured at the center of the house. And this, so this is the Mesh House with its central courtyard. This is all cherry wood. It's very perforate. There are many voids and glimpses through the house, so it feels a bit like you're in a tree house. And then the Windward House, which again is an extension to a historic house that you can see here on the right, and then that kind of low, dark building is the main house. And it's and then the pool house and the walled courtyard. And this again was a thesis, a kind of culmination of all those earlier essays, to basically arrive at a language of architecture that is informal and meandering, non-orthogonal, that tries to blur the boundary between interior and exterior, pull light in from above. Laterally, it sort of contrasts the historic house with the with it new and integrate everything with an art collection. So this owner had an art collection that inspired the use of walnut, because most of his collection was African and Indian tribal art made of walnut, and so there's a kind of dialogue there. So back to the Smile. So the Smile, again, this was really a great project I was trying to find a form, and with 72 cubic meters of hardwood, that was the kind of brief, make something compelling and engaging for the public to experience during London Design Week. So I thought the opposite of what a building looks like is an arc, something that's balancing on a point and has a curved floor. So this project was really a way of creating a synthesis between geometry, material, structure, space, and form. It was really a kind of singularity, somebody described it. And it focuses on views at either end, but was just very immersive in terms of the physical act of walking up the ramp and then finding the view at the end. So this was a great project, like one of the best projects I've ever had as ABA, a sort of client who wants to do an experiment and build it really quickly and have it enjoyed by the public. And I've also used timber in in this exhibition at the Venice Biennale, recasting, that was also 2018. And then again in 2021, this was called Home Ground. This isn't necessarily about timber, but it's about housing, public space, community, and the way housing can work as social infrastructure. And so it's all of my housing projects gathered into one sort of Campo Marzio type figure, like imaginary city with the residential elements of the architecture hovering above. And this is one of those buildings in Tottenham Hale. So mixed use, retail, office, and residential. Another project I did was Folkestone Performing Arts Center. This is inspired by the seashells, the scallop shells of Folkestone. Very difficult to get other kind of theatrical projects in the UK. The theaters don't come around very often, and the competition is stiff. And this is most of my projects I've won in competition. So except for the private houses, everything's been in competition. This was London School of Economics, Faraz Lalji Global Hub, which I was shortlisted for, but didn't win, unfortunately. But recently I've won a project with LSE, which is kind of a relief. So I'm going to, I know probably running out of time, but I'll take you through a few projects quite quickly. And this is a project that is close to my heart. It's, again, a competition that I won in 2011 for a new university building in Oxford. And most of you, I'm sure, know that Oxford, and like Cambridge, is a city made of college buildings. It's made of quadrangles. And Exeter College is one of the oldest, 14th century. It was founded, and these images on the right, you can see the existing quadrangles and a church by George Gilbert Scott. Everything is listed, nothing can be touched. So the college bought a new site on the sort of 8-minute walk away from its historic quad for a new residential and academic quad. And it stems from the tradition of the monastery, the monastic tradition of a community living and worshiping and studying together in a sort of enclosed compound of building types, including cloister and chapel and refectory. And the Oxford tradition grows from this monastic tradition, and Exeter College, these are the historic drawings and images of Exeter College. And they wanted a new quad for 90 students, but also teaching space and lecture hall and seminar rooms and a fully self-sufficient quad. But this site had an existing building on it that you can see, and that was Ruskin College, and that facade had to be preserved. So this competition involved 2 stages, and the first stage was a kind of short expression of interest where we had to propose a kind of an approach, illustrate how we would approach the site and the project. And so these diagrams were kind of demonstrating tests, like figure ground tests, to show how you could move from the very conventional sort of C-shaped quad to a completely fragmented and atomized series of pavilions and everything in between. And so I left a kind of open question as to how we would approach it at the next stage. And what we did end up settling on was this S-shaped quad in plan. And what you can see, because it's a very long and thin site, the S-shaped quad creates the opportunity for 2 courtyards, one facing south, one facing north, and a kind of meander of spaces between those 2 courtyards. And these diagrams show what that means in terms of creating a journey. So the idea of a route through the center of the building, which is a kind of new interpretation of a cloister, a 3-dimensional journey to accommodate the site, and the idea of a kind of landscape and continuity, so there are no dead ends in the building, and it's about connecting to the city around it. And so here's the plan. So it's the ground floor and lower ground floor are all teaching spaces, sort of seminars, teaching rooms, an amphitheater, cloister. But the big opportunity of the project was the center, which this kind of knuckle where the plan form turns. And here I brought a new program to the competition that wasn't in the brief, which was a learning commons. So a multi-level social learning space, which was completely outside the brief, but I felt was needed for a contemporary institution. And then, so this is at the heart of, it's like a community space at the heart of the building, more teaching spaces, another cloister, and then an auditorium sort of destination at the end. And then the entire lower ground floor is also teaching spaces. And in a way, the project is organized via these cloisters, and these are timber. The one on the left, the convex cloister, is made of blades of CLT, softwood, sorry, softwood CLT, and it's fully glazed, so when you're in the cloister, it's like you're outside. And then in the one on the right, that's a concrete cloister, it's holding up the building. And then the pavilion at the end is the auditorium, and that's also glulam timber. And here is how that was expressed in our installation in the Venice Biennale, so you could sort of read the activity and the life of this project. And here, again, in a way, my obsession with cutting and folding planes was the strategy for the roof. So the roof is conceived as a single plane of metal, which is cut and folded and sort of draped over the program like a cloak. And this series of folded forms allow the building to step down in scale from a 5-story building to a single-story pavilion. And it's very dense with program, the lower ground floor. There's an archive, a sort of ancient collections archive, and then the teaching floors on the ground, and the learning commons, and then student accommodation on 2 floors, and then more accommodation and fellows research offices, and then more accommodation on the roof. So it's kind of like a campus in a building, super dense. And here's the finished building with cladding, metal stainless steel shingles inspired by the leaded spire of the historic chapel in the historic campus. So yeah, many years and documents had to be produced to get planning. Here are the shingles being fabricated in Enfield, the kind of stippled and bead blasted sheet steel, 1-to-1 mock-ups. And then here's the construction. So the auditorium, which is column-free, so these wishbone columns hold up the beams to create a column-free space and to pull light into the auditorium. It's also about craftsmanship, so I wanted this project to be a celebration of craft. William Morris was an alumnus of Exeter College and also a student of Ruskin, so all of this history and legacy comes together. So this is we retained and restored the facade, lowered all the windows at street level to provide more transparency, and here's the kind of journey through the building. So the entrance foyer gives you a sense of a kind of destination through the cloister. And because it's a glazed cloister, the light quality changes constantly. So on sort of gray days, it's a very soft light that you can see here, maybe inspired by the Salisbury Cathedral. And then the building itself, only 4 materials in the whole building: concrete, stone, and American black cherry. And I think I forgot to mention, the whole reason I sort of fell in love with black cherry originally was because my mother, who collected early North American antique furniture, she sort of brainwashed me into believing that black cherry was the most beautiful wood that existed, and she had all these really beautiful pieces of cherry. So in a way, all my work with cherry is a tribute to my mother, who also kind of inspired my interest in the arts and architecture. So here is the cloister, and you can see it's fully glazed, but the arches are timber and they create this kind of filter. And the cloister leads to the learning commons on 3 levels, and there's an amphitheater. And so here's the way the light changes during the day, and the cloisters provide this surface for light and shadow. And in between each blade of timber, you can see in and out of certain seminar rooms and classrooms. Here's a little film so you can see the kind of dual nature of the cloister. It's both transparent but also focusing. And here's the learning commons. So you can see it provides different places for students to study, acoustically separated, very secluded or more open, and it's a way of bringing everybody in the college together, and everybody sees each other, sort of walking through. Here's the North Cloister, seminar rooms. Transparency is critical, so students feel safe, and they're, but also together, but able to be, to work in basically all the parts of the building. The idea was that it would feel like home, that to sort of upend all of the institutional conventions like suspended ceilings and drywall, and make as much as possible every space have a kind of character and identity. And here the auditorium, you can see, has this kind of weightlessness. The ceiling, the roof structure pulls up, flips up to pull light in from the south. And here's the section and the setting out of all of the glulam ribs, quite complicated geometrically, the flitch plate, but it all came together very nicely. And this, it's very transparent. It can be closed off with blinds, but in a way, all of these spaces were conceived to allow residents and users of the building to see other people in other parts of the building simultaneously. And here's the learning commons. Every corridor is a place to study and dwell. The archive, staircases that provide views, the student kitchens, which again are transparent and warm, and then the student rooms. And up under the roof, the curved roof, are some of the fellows' research offices. So they have tutorials, and they have their research sort of permanent fellowships up there under the roof. And the idea here was to make it one of the most beautiful places in the building where the tutors are, so that students would go to their tutorials. So it would be a destination. And then, in a way, the journey through the building culminates on the roof. So there's a kind of cut out of the roof form, and this is a roof terrace, and here you can see across Oxford. So this idea of kind of opening up the collegiate quad from something internal and inward looking into something open and outward looking, and a kind of softened, non-ecclesiastical form and figure and iconography was in a way the thesis of that project. And then maybe if I have time for one more project, I can talk about Cadence and King's Cross. Now, this is not a project about timber, this is about housing in the city, but it is about earth-based materials. So when we talk about architecture and nature, it's not just wood. There's also, earth and brick and terracotta and, even some kinds of metal. At least they are natural in origin, and if they can be produced and recycled using sustainable energy, then they're also kind of earth-based materials. But obviously brick is one of the better ones, and concrete is on its way to becoming sustainable, we hope. So this project is, again, a competition that I won in 2017. And this is King's Cross, and if any of you have been to London, you'll know about King's Cross, how successful the regeneration has been. So this is a master plan, sort of anchored by the two train stations, St. Pancras Station here on the left, and King's Cross Station on the right. And this master plan has taken 25 years to complete, but every plot in the master plan was opened to a competition. So the developers made sure that every plot was something that was ambitious, and the brief was kind of controlled, and the planning framework was also strictly controlled by the council in terms of height and quality. And King's Cross today is an amazing mix of heritage buildings and new, and this image in the middle is the site. Basically at the top of the park, at the center of the master plan, there was this site for a new residential and mixed-use development. And it's also a kind of gateway from the north. So it was kind of an opportunity for something at the end of an axis. So when I was doing the competition, I felt that the most important thing about King's Cross, its identity, how people associate with it, are the two train stations, and could that kind of spirit of place and material sensibility and exuberance, sort of 19th century exuberance, make its way up to the top of the park. And then of course in the background are my kind of references buried in my subconscious, the Place des Vosges, the Forum of Trajan. And in a way, during the competition, many different tests and trials of how the site, very unusual shape of site, how could this be expressed? And here's one of the tests, this idea of just really going for it with arches and bringing that kind of experimental and lyrical idea of facade articulation that the 19th century is famous for, sort of reviving that in some way. And here is the kind of evolution of the form. I describe this as carving because we normally start with a three-dimensional envelope that's fixed in terms of massing in a master plan context, and then I sort of carve that into a form that is suitable for housing. So the next diagram shows how the, sort of bringing a residential depth to the building, which is here 16 meters, to the sort of bars of housing, and then sort of further carving it to bring light into the central courtyard. And then the massing also responds to there are train tunnels going under the site. Practically every project I work on in London has train tunnels underneath it. So that's kind of set the geometry of the tower on the left because it has the underground going underneath it. And then the tower on the right has its own core, and you can see it's a courtyard building, and there's a reflecting pool at the center. And a central point of access, a kind of foyer, and then commercial spaces in all four corners to activate the public realm, and a cloister also around the center of the building. So the idea was to create a sort of urban tableau with sort of animated silhouette, and to introduce arches to both the base and to punctuate the facade at certain moments with arches. And here are some of our tests, our experiments to try and find, sort of form finding how to kind of reimagine the arch in a contemporary way that had the same kind of expressiveness as the George Gilbert Scott's Arches of St. Pancras Station. So here's our competition scheme, and so the main tower that is on center with the axis of the park, and the idea was that the whole building would act as a kind of gateway to the master plan. And this arch made in plywood that we did for the Venice Biennale, that is one of our Bezier arches, but we tried to dematerialize it fully to make it sort of made of light rather than brick. And then we made many models, kind of finessing the openings, the model of the ground floor, and then the developed scheme. And the idea was that as you move around it, it changes. So the project presents a kind of different relationship to the public realm, and then at a certain point, the base kind of peels away from the top because that was above the train line, and we couldn't actually build on top of that. So we just decided, I thought this would be an opportunity, kind of like St. Pancras Station, where the viaducts just extend out past the building. And it's a very London thing, kind of viaducts sprinkled throughout the city. So the other kind of experimental quality of this project is that the whole thing is, oops, sorry, that's repeated, but the whole thing is prefabricated. So everything in the building, other than the slab and the footings, was prefabricated off-site, and so we designed every element, like slabs, columns, beams, lift, cores, and facades as off-site fabrication. And here you can see the forms in the factory in Sheffield. So those are plywood forms that have every brick CNC machined into the plywood. The bricks are York handmade bricks. They're cut in half, laid on the forms, and then they pour the concrete on the brick. Then they tilt the panels up, as you can see here, in the yard, and apply insulation to the back and pointing on the front. So the quality control is very high. The brick layers were actually from Portugal. So we had, masons, proper brick masons doing the bricklaying, but in a contemporary sort of factory condition. And one of the most important things about offsite fabrication is reducing waste or eliminating construction waste. So here, most building sites, they're like a builder's yard. You've got mountains of blocks and mountains of bricks, and things get broken and go missing and thrown away. And with offsite fabrication, you have a very clean, very compact site, and all the components are going up pretty much 4 stories away. The facade is being installed as the frame is being erected, and the quality control is very high. So here you can see the competition render and the finished building, which are very similar, which makes us all very happy in the office. It's always good to try as hard as you can to build your competition winning scheme. Like, don't try to redesign it after the competition, or if you do, bring it back to what the winning scheme was. And so here it acts as this kind of sentinel at the top of the park, and it's kind of amazing how people respond to these arches. It's practically the first thing everybody says is, I love that building, and I love the arches. And actually, in the Colin Ellard book, Places of the Heart, he explains why people love arches. So you all have to buy the book and read it to understand why. But it is about curves, you know, the human brain, how the human brain responds to curves, to softened geometries. And the arch is, you know, a pretty obvious expression of curvature, whether it's, you know, natural or organic or controlled. But it does generate a pretty powerful response. And here are ways in which we've kind of, in certain moments, elaborated on the detail of the building with precast elements. And this is in the courtyard. This is the stair up to the cycle store. Tried to make something beautiful out of that very functional stair. And here's the foyer. So I could talk about a couple more projects, but you have to tell me when to stop, because these are projects that are in the works. Just keep going.
We love it.
Okay, I mean, this is a mass timber building, and this is a competition I won in 2021 for Homerton College in Cambridge. And this is, you can see the site here at the bottom of the slide, and it's a pretty big college. It's got lots of land, so it's not like the Oxford College, super constrained. This has a lot of land and a really mixed collection of buildings around its perimeter from all different periods and styles without a master plan, and a kind of really unfortunate address. So this is the Hills Road, this is its front door, and nobody can find the front door and knows where to enter the campus. And this is actually the front door to the college on the left, this sort of 90s building, which is a library that in the foyer on the right here has this kind of really quite grim Porter's Lodge reception. And so the college decided it needed a new entrance building to express its identity and to give it a presence and a place in the Cambridge collegiate context. And here are images of this very eclectic mix of buildings that form the perimeter to the college, and then this really unhappy frontage that currently acts as the front door. And so I was really interested in this building. This is a listed arts and crafts building, I think 1840, and it's super eclectic, you know, mix of, you know, sort of semicircular Palladian arches and sort of dressed stone windows, and then a very straightforward colonnade, kind of portico, steep pitched roofs, very characterful building, very unusual. And then I thought in a way, the porch, the veranda, which is a very traditional kind of North American way of expressing arrival and welcome in a more of a domestic sphere, but it has a very important role to play in terms of creating that sort of filter between the public realm and the private realm and expressing welcome. And I also felt that this building needed to be omnidirectional, and so there are obvious precedents, the Villa Rotunda and other kind of biaxially symmetrical buildings, which was also a bit of an experiment. I've never really done a super symmetrical building before, but I thought this was a moment to actually try that. And so these early sketches show this idea of a kind of lantern building with a very generous porch or veranda that would sit as an introduction to the college and express this idea of welcome, but also echo the arts and crafts character, which is very much about domestic comfort and the idea of family. And so here's the kind of strategy. We wanted it to be net zero, so it's a mass timber frame you can see on the left, so a very simple skeleton, optimized in terms of spans and carbon. by our structural engineers. And then the idea of veranda, stacking program, so there's a study and research center on the upper 2 floors, cladding the whole thing in copper, so it's a single material, kind of timeless, long-lasting material, and then connecting to the existing library. And our structural engineers use this software called PANDA, Parametric and Numeric Design Assessment, where basically you plug in the parameters of the building, the spans, the distances, and it comes up with the optimum span and thickness of CLT, of beams, of depth, and now it also, you can add in cost. So it's, parametric analysis, and so this generated approximately 3.5 meter grid with 100 mil CLT planks, and here's the final building, which has a kind of presence and scale that had to sort of fit in this context. The planning regime is very tough in Cambridge, but that sort of echoes its arts and crafts ancestors on the other part of the college, but has this very open and inviting exhibition space and reception. And so here's the plan. I mean, it's very, if you work in timber, you'll know that it's very controlling. Like when you reveal all the columns and beams, you have to work within that ordering system. It's not like concrete, where you can just put anything anywhere. So very simple plan form, but we're expressing the beams and the ceiling finishes. As much as possible, I avoid using plasterboard and paint, so working with timber or timber paneling is really the way to go. And stone. So basically here, all the finishes are intrinsic materials, stone, brass, and timber. And actually we got Cohen on board to quote for installing and supplying and erecting this project, and it was all going to happen and about to proceed, and the college had a change of master and bursar, and so they brought new people on board, and so the project will go ahead. But it should have been built by now, but the politics of colleges is something, time has no ending. And so it's naturally ventilated, and it will definitely be a net zero carbon project, and this is something that we hope we'll be able to build within the next couple of years. And just to sort of fill in the little bit that happens in the film tomorrow, if any of you go to see the film, my house is in the film, and so here is, in a way, the experimental home. Every architect, if you work on your own house, it will take 10 or 15 years, but it has to be an experiment, so it's worth the wait. And so this is actually my house. This is the first time I've ever shown anybody this project. So it's an 1899 arts and crafts house at the front, and then you can see where the curved bit at the back happens. That's the extension. That appears in the film. That's going to be in the film tomorrow. And so really this extension was a way of extending the house into the garden, to create a kind of garden pavilion that's appended to the house. And you can see this very thick buildup, mainly of insulation. And holding up all that thick insulation are American black cherry glulam beams, which are curved in this kind of sled profile that you might recognize from the Cohen Quad in Oxford. And so the idea here was to create this kind of garden pavilion, and rather than lots of glass on the roof, to create an oculus, so a central circular aperture to bring light in during the day. And it is a hybrid structure. There's an outer steel skeleton that holds the rain beam, and then the cherry wood beams are the rafters holding up the ply and the copper and the insulation. So it's so it's all the same curvature. It's just that the lengths change because the obviously the perimeter is angled, so everything is a slightly different length. This is when it was a construction site. You can see the compound, builder's compound, after they ruined the garden. But at least they did a very nice job on the roof, which is copper. And this is the oculus, which you can look out the windows at the back of the house, and the trees are reflected in the oculus, which is very nice. And then here's the kitchen, like literally about half an hour after it was finished. So terrazzo floor that becomes an island, and cherry wood cabinets, and here's the roof, our extension, and that's the contractor, Mark Abrams. And this was about an hour before a party was going to happen, and they were just clearing out everything in the house. But you can see the hybrid nature here, the steel columns, which are welded and filleted to merge with the perimeter ring beam, so steel beam, and it's pinned back to the house with cleats, but the whole structure is held up on those two very slender columns. And in a way, this project, it was a little bit about channeling the late Victorian, early Edwardian eclectic vibe and bringing it into form in the garden. That's one of the builders actually on the terrace, looking at his phone. Our builders had the nicest time because they were just hanging out in the garden for the last 3 years while they built this extension. But in a way, this project because it's so small, it has allowed us to sort of bring that sense of being in nature, being in the garden, being with the wood, and even the pebbles in the terrazzo, they're from a beach in Italy. So we're very fortunate to have this this opportunity, and we look up at this oculus and see the clouds and the weather changing, and that's looking back. So that's sort of inside the existing house. But what's amazing is that the light tracks across the floor, so in the morning that circle of light is on the east side, and then it tracks around to the west, and then we've also done a couple of, this is the stair underneath the first stair I showed you, so bringing up from the front hall of the house, also in solid cherry. So, and here's our newly rewilded garden with lots of different species, not just grass. And like the other projects I was going to show are in Toronto. It's renovating a brutalist building and extending onto it, working with Indigenous representatives from the University of Toronto, converting a brutalist inward-looking building from sort of that to that, and that's a project that's ongoing right now, and we're building this pavilion. And then we just won a competition with the London School of Economics to convert this building into an academic building. Right now it's like that, and we're going to convert it into that. So this is the end of my lecture. Please buy the monograph, T.C. Cuadernos, Spanish publisher, you may know, and thank you very much.